All right, everyone. Really excited to have Jon with us here today from NZS Capital. Jon, thank you for being here with us. And why NZS? Let's just start like really high level with that, and then we'll dive into semis and TSMC.
Why NZS? Good question. So I guess I'll give you my quick background. I've been doing equity research for 12 years, or I guess 13 years now. I spent my first 12 years of my career at Janus in Denver doing tech research, and kind of by good fortune, actually one of the first companies I worked on when I started in 2008 happened to be Tsmc. So I kind of got to watch them grow up and come into their own. I'm into a $500 billion company now, which is pretty incredible. And then I had the chance in early 2020, actually right before the pandemic really took hold, to join NZS Capital, which is a boutique investment firm started by two of my kind of teammates and mentors from Janus. And so I'll give you the quick background on our framework. We don't have to spend too much time on this, but so NZS is the idea of non-zero sumness. And so it's just a game theory term for basically for win-win outcomes. And so our framework for investing, and this is something we obviously believe in enough to name the company after it, is we're looking for companies that create more value than they take for themselves. And this is for all stakeholders, not just for customers, but or not just for shareholders, but for customers, stakeholders, employees, the environment, and society as a whole. And actually, I think TSMC is like one of the all-time best examples of a high NZS company, because it's this company that at any point in the 30 years or 40-year history of the company, they could have taken more value for themselves and raised prices or done what they wanted to do, but instead they've been focused on creating a platform and really creating value for their customers, and they've honestly changed the world. And so that's kind of our lens of the world, is we look for companies that have high NZS, we call it. And so that's kind of our lens of the world.
Beautiful. And early on, were you just put on TSMC, or did you have some interest in semis and those types of companies back then, or how did that happen?
Yeah, I kind of got lucky. I knew I wanted to cover tech. I mean, I was, I guess, 23 at the time, and so I didn't have like a lot of history with semiconductors or anything. But I knew I wanted to cover tech. I didn't know what a chip was when I started. It was a different world. There was no, Twitter or like tons of podcasts to learn about investing quickly, to be honest. And so I kind of got thrown to the wolves and got to cover semis and a few other spaces pretty early. And then actually just for context, I did spend most of my 12 years at Janus covering the tech supply chain and semiconductors globally. I got to go out to Hsinchu a handful of times and visit TSMC, and so kind of got to live and breathe this stuff for more than a decade.
Amazing. So I guess to set context, Jon, if we could go super high level, just start with what a semiconductor even is and what it does and why it matters. And before we dig into TSMC, maybe to your point about the value chain and the ecosystem, who are the big players? Where do they sit? What do they do? That might help maybe frame this conversation for us.
Yeah, sure. I was going to start with a little bit of history, if that's okay.
Great. Yeah.
So the history of the industry dates back to the late 40s when William Shockley invented the transistor at Bell Labs. That was in 1948, and he actually went on. It's just kind of a fun fact of history. He went on to he won a Nobel Prize, I think, and then he went on to start Shockley Semiconductor and recruited a lot of kind of the iconic founders of the semi industry, including Gordon Moore, who went on to found Intel. And then 10 years later, Jack Kilby at Texas Instruments invented the transistor, which was the idea of actually taking like multiple circuits and putting it into one substrate. So you can actually build a chip for the first time, a kind of a usable, semiconductor chip, I would say. And so that was in 1958. And I think it's just kind of another fun artifact of history that, first of all, that, TI, who's still one of kind of the 800-pound gorillas in the industry, that they're still around, obviously, and that they were kind of one of the founding, behemoths of the chip industry. And so I guess the way I would frame it, and the R&D lab at TI is still named after Jack Kilby, which I think is kind of cool. And so to kind of get up to the value chain and kind of how we got to where we are today, I think I don't want to go through like the whole history of the industry, but I think there's a few ways to frame it. One is if you go back to kind of like the 60s and 70s and the invention of the industry, and even through the 80s, I would say, and this will kind of bleed into the TSMC conversation. But it really is like all the companies used to do everything themselves. They had their own kind of like software tools to actually design the chip. A lot of them built their own equipment, and then they would design the chips themselves, and then they actually would own factories also. And so it became, I mean, first of all, it was just a heavy burden if you're trying to follow Moore's law, which was obviously in its infancy at that point. But it's a pretty heavy burden to kind of like have like, finding a lot of battles on different fronts, basically. And so the way the industry really evolved, from the late 80s through today is we really moved to kind of a more horizontal model where, for most of the value stack in semiconductors, there's like 2 or 3 companies, or sometimes just one company that can really do that thing very well. And the reason for that is if you look at a lot of different parts of the value chain, like building a factory these days, like a leading edge chip factory, costs $10 billion plus. And so just the scale you need to get to that, to be able to obviously, meet that kind of a capital outlay is significant. On the design side, designing a chip at the very bleeding edge, like if you hear about, 5 nanometer and 7 nanometer right now, the cost of that design is like $500 million in some cases. If you look at like Apple's most bleeding edge chip, it takes thousands of engineers. And so again, just the scale you need to do that. And by the way, if you're on 5 nanometer, that's 5 nanometers is like 1/10,000th the width of a human hair. And so like the precision with which these engineers are putting these things together is incredible. And then you think about the scale, again, on the CapEx side, like TSMC is spending $30 billion in CapEx this year, and $4 billion in R&D actually. And so that did drive a lot of consolidation in the industry. We can talk about that if that'd be helpful. But over the last 7 years or so, you've just seen this massive wave in consolidation, probably like $400 or $500 billion worth of kind of cumulative M&A that has really driven, kind of a handful of 800-pound gorillas in each kind of subsector of the market. And the other way I think about I'll just give kind of like one other piece of kind of the way that we got to where we are, and then I can kind of go through the ecosystem and a little more just kind of basics on what a chip is and who sells to who. But I like to think about the market also in terms of end market drivers. That when the industry really launched, in the 60s, I think the guys at Intel and TI had the insight that you really needed something high volume and just to spread out your costs and amortize your manufacturing base. And so the consumer applications were kind of the first target. And so you saw chips go into radios and TVs, and even TI did like the calculator, the iconic, and like Speak and Spell and things like that, some of their iconic consumer electronics products. And then that obviously created enough scale in the industry to start building more like basic computers, or putting even like for the space race and things like that, having more access to computing. And then the industry really shifted. I kind of think of like 4 different waves of computing from from mainframes to PCs to notebooks and then to smartphones. And then so that kind of gets you to like the middle of last decade. And though those were kind of the key demand drivers, each of those was like lasted for roughly give or take a decade. And what's so exciting about the industry now, and I think the shortages, honestly, that we're seeing have brought this to light, is like there's no one kind of like end market driver for semiconductors anymore. It's obviously like the automotive industry has become a big consumer of chips, and you hear about it like every day. It's on the cover of some publication every day that we're seeing chip shortages in automotive, and a lot of the key differentiation in a car is based on silicon now. Like I would argue my next car I buy, like a more important decision for me is, does it have like active safety and lane departure detection, or does it have some sort of like electrification? That's a lot more important to me than like how many horsepower it has, to be honest. I don't think it's even close. And then you also it's not just automotive guys. It's you hear about like Deere. There was a really good interview with the John Deere CEO or CTO a few weeks ago, and they're talking about putting NVIDIA GPUs on combine harvesters and using machine vision to actually target like each crop and actually use like targeted precision agriculture instead of just like blasting crops with planes, which we've been doing for decades. But they're worried about getting chips too, right? And then you hear about someone like Intuitive Surgical for robotic assisted surgery. They need chips also. And so that's just what's so exciting about what's going on in the industry right now, and is really a change in the last 4 or 5 years, I would say, is you're seeing an inflection where we've kind of been talking about this idea of everything being connected for a long time. And I would say semis have gone from like being with the kind of the benefit and the problem of kind of just like core IT companies like an Apple or a Cisco to chips really go into everything now and matter to everyone. So I whiteboarded this if I can share my screen, and I can just kind of go through the ecosystem really quickly.
All right, you should be co-host now and be able to share your screen.
All right, let's give this a shot. So I drew this up on my whiteboard. Can you guys see that? Great. So this lays out kind of the ecosystem. And so just a little bit of background. Since we're talking about TSMC, I focused on digital chips, and this is probably a helpful time just to talk about like what semiconductors really are, what chips are. So there are a few different kinds of chips. If you think about digital chips like they would be built at someone like TSMC. These are kind of the processors or the brains of any electronic system, and so that could be the $10 chip in your that manages your smartphone. It could be a $100 chip, give or take, in a PC that will run Excel for you and do all the functions in your PC. And if you go up to a data center, it could be multiple thousands of dollars for kind of like an Intel Xeon or an NVIDIA GPU. That's like a really heavy computing digital chip that would be in the data center. And so that's the focus of this this slide on the whiteboard here, and just the other kind of chips that we can talk about if it'd be helpful, but I didn't kind of highlight for today. And so the context on digital chips is digital chips think in zeros and ones, like it's a mathematically driven, computer science driven system of thinking in binary and really churning out computing power basically. And so switch that over to analog. So analog chips would be built by someone like Texas Instruments, and actually the average analog chip sells for about 30 cents. And so it's a different model than what you hear from the digital guys, where it's in the tens or hundreds or thousands of dollars. But what analog chips do is they the physical world, like the real world we live in, does not actually think in zeros and ones, right? Like temperature or vibration or wireless signals are kind of like natural phenomenon. What you have to do is have chips that can take kind of an outside real world signal and convert it into zeros and ones to be fed into some sort of a computing system. And so that's what analog chips do. And so that's another kind of big pocket of the industry where you would hear companies like Texas Instruments or Analog Devices playing. And then the other kind of pocket of the industry, which again I didn't go into because it doesn't relate too much to the TSMC discussion, but what we can talk about if it'd be helpful, is memory, which is of the $500 billion semiconductor industry, memory is probably $150 billion or so. And so memory is split into two pockets. There's NAND flash, which is, if you think about like when you buy a new iPhone and you get 264 gigabytes of flash memory to stash your your photos and podcasts and music and things like that. That's flash memory. And then DRAM is the other kind of memory, and DRAM would actually sit closer to the processor and actually kind of help speed up the more difficult computing tasks. And so DRAM content will increase over time, just as computing tasks on a system get more difficult. So that's a little bit high level on just the kind of three different parts of the industry that at least the way that I kind of cut it. And so if it'd be helpful, I can kind of run through the ecosystem really quick. This is a little bit of a busy slide, but this can kind of tee up the conversation on TSMC versus Intel especially. So great. So on the left side here is what's known as the foundry model. And so the core companies you hear about in the foundry model are TSMC, which is the foundry itself. And TSMC is like the only pure play foundry in the world. I put Samsung in there because they're often a second source, but they also, honestly, they can kind of sit on both sides of the slide because Samsung also designs and builds their own chips internally. And so they're honestly not quite like, TSMC is kind of like Switzerland in the industry. And so the companies you hear about the most in the space is the second row from the top here, which is the chip designers themselves. So these are called fabless chip companies. Fabless meaning they do not own their own fabs. So that's companies like NVIDIA, Qualcomm, AMD that are actually pure chip companies. And then actually what you call systems companies that are designing their own chips now are Apple and Amazon and Google, and really most of the major US tech platforms, especially and in China, I would add as well, are designing their own semiconductors now. It's kind of a funny, it's kind of a funny full circle way the industry has worked, that for so long the industry has gone from kind of like vertical integration into more horizontal model, and then just with semiconductors becoming so much more strategic, we're kind of going back into this vertical integration mindset a little bit from the big tech platforms. And so the way the ecosystem fits together is I actually drew these little arrows with dollar signs, so it's kind of hard to picture like who actually is the customer of whom and who pays who. So the EDA software, the top row here, that's actually the CAD software. That's a really important part of the ecosystem, where a semiconductor engineer that goes into their desk every day at NVIDIA or at Apple, and each of these companies has thousands of these engineers. They go to work every day and actually lay out the chip in like CAD EDA software. It's not that different if you've ever looked at Autodesk or like architecture software, where like you're laying out a house. It's just that you're laying a house with rooms that are one 10,000th the size of a human hair, and there are billions of them, right? And so the precision with which the software is run is just incredible. And these companies have been around for 40 years. I've kind of like grown up in the semiconductor ecosystem and collaborate really closely with both with their customers, like with the NVIDIAs and Qualcomms of the world, but also with TSMC. And so if you hear Cadence or Synopsys talking about their roadmap, it will just plug directly into TSMC's roadmap, and they'll say, we're ready for 3 nanometer, and we're already working on 2 nanometer and 1.5 nanometer to really kind of be one of the key enablers of Moore's law. And so the chip designers pay the EDA software vendors for that. It's actually outside of headcount. EDA software is the biggest cost center for a for a chip design company like an NVIDIA or an Apple even. So the next line below the chip centers is the architecture, and I wrote ISA in there because you hear that a lot. That means the instruction set architecture. And so the various architectures you see in the chip industry that you hear a lot about, x86 is the big one. You can see that on the right side on the Intel slide, and also this is probably a little bit hard to see, but it's right below AMD. And so x86 has been kind of the workhorse architecture for the industry for the last 30 years. And so until very recently, every PC in the world was built on a chip. At least I would say for the last 15 years, up until recently, the x86 architecture has been the dominant architecture for the PC industry and also for the server industry. And so that's kind of been like the Intel just brute force your way down Moore's law architecture. And then the ARM architecture, which you would see under like Qualcomm or Apple, that's the architecture that's most well suited for mobile. And so ARM really saw their kind of rise to prominence, coinciding with the mobile revolution and the rise of the smartphone, which was kind of early last decade. And so ARM has a different business model than the rest of the architectures actually aren't really companies. They're just, it's kind of like thinking about it like a V8 engine. It's just an architecture. But ARM is different. They actually invented the instruction set. And then they, instead of going out and trying to build their own chips, they realized that would take too much scale. And so they actually licensed the instruction set. And so ARM is a licensing company. They're actually potentially on the verge of being acquired by NVIDIA. Well, we'll see kind of how that goes with the regulatory bodies. And then the other architecture that's become really prominent is the GPU, which is the graphics processing unit that you'd see that under NVIDIA. And so graphics processors were originally used and invented for image rendering and for gaming, especially for kind of like AAA gaming applications. If you really want to play the highest quality, kind of like first-person shooter type games with the best graphics, you need kind of an added GPU to your PC to do that. And so you can buy those from NVIDIA and AMD. And then what really happened in 2014 or so is there was this realization that the GPUs could be used for artificial intelligence, especially, but also just for accelerating kind of any workload. You can actually put some GPUs next to an Intel CPU, and for a lot of kind of heavy computing tasks, it can speed up the workload dramatically. And so GPUs have really come into focus over the last 7 or 8 years, to the point that actually Intel used to be in the GPU business and they got out of it, and now they're actually trying to get back into it. So that's
Jon, just really quick, I'm curious on ARM. Was it some counter positioning thing, or why were they well positioned to take on mobile, and like why didn't Intel or others, with their scale and everything at that point, why weren't they able to capitalize on that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's honestly this classic innovator's dilemma that Intel, I think, first of all, Intel actually used to have an ARM business and they actually sold it. And I think that was honestly a little bit of arrogance. They sold their ARM business in 2005 or 6 to Marvell, which is another fabless company. And so when you really saw the rise of the smartphone, kind of like in 2009, 2010, Intel was really betting on their x86 architecture being able to push into the smartphone because it had worked kind of everywhere else. It had worked in PCs, and at the time, PCs were the dominant computing platform. But what they missed is, for forever, PCs had to be plugged into the wall and like have a fan. Like they were not well suited for well power, right? And so that's what's different about the ARM architecture. It was just fundamentally built for low power, and the company had been around for a long time, honestly, with not a ton of success. But then when smartphones really hit their stride, it was just the obvious choice. And then one thing that's different between ARM and Intel, and honestly, there's kind of a contrast between these two models, which we can go into a little bit, between the foundry model and the IDM model overall, is ARM is really kind of an open ecosystem where they're licensing their IP to probably 20 different companies, all trying to invent the next best smartphone chip, versus Intel, it's like they're just going at their own with their own architecture. And so just kind of the iteration and the pace of innovation that you saw from kind of the ARM ecosystem just, kind of outpaced Intel. I think Intel has always kind of had this kind of like trying to brute force a square peg into a round hole mindset. Or like, if you've got to hammer everything as a nail, you can kind of pick the analogy. But that's why Intel wasn't able to make the pivot, and they really threw everything at the mobile market because they saw it as existential. And at the time, mobile was also really cannibalizing, notebook sales, and netbooks were kind of this idea of kind of like a dress down notebook. They were supposed to take off and then didn't. So I mean, at one point, Intel was selling chips into mobile or trying to for less than their COGS basically, and taking negative gross margins on them. And so anyway, that's kind of why they missed the market. It's a really good question, and it's an important part of the TSMC conversation also.
And John, just really quick, so if EDA is such a big part of the chip designs, margins, and costs and everything, is that a pretty stable duopoly between Cadence and Synopsys? Is that super competitive, or what does that look like today?
Yeah, it's a really healthy duopoly. So there is kind of a third player called Mentor Graphics. They were actually acquired by Siemens kind of in the middle of last decade. But in terms of, I mean, there are like hundreds of steps of designing a chip, and the only companies in the world that can provide, they call it the full design flow, where you can really like soup to nuts use Cadence or Synopsys throughout the whole process. They're the only two companies that can do it, and so that's also another industry where there used to be kind of more price aggression. Now they're on subscription models. These are actually were kind of like the first two companies to go through subscription model transitions before like Adobe and Autodesk kind of brought it into vogue. But so that actually really improved pricing because the way the industry evolved is the sales guy at Cadence at the end of the quarter would be trying to kind of get the get the contract done, and the customer would hold out for kind of either longer duration or a better price. And so there used to be a lot of kind of destructive pricing, and then the industry really kind of rationalized. I would say kind of early last decade, and so now it's just kind of a really strong, healthy duopoly where I think they're honestly a little bit cautious talking about it because they don't want to kind of piss off their customers or like trigger any regulatory red flags, but pricing is really healthy. And so and these they're great partners too, like thinking in our framework of looking for kind of high NZS businesses, these also fit this very well because they're like the whole $500 billion semiconductor industry is standing on the shoulders of basically two companies, Cadence and Synopsys, to design these chips, right? And the precision that they're doing it with is phenomenal. And these companies also still spend like 35% of sales on R&D. It's like one of the most R&D intensive businesses in the world. And so it's a really high quality market. It's a good question.
Cool, appreciate it. Should we move on to manufacturing?
Sure, yeah, and feel free to jump in. I know this is kind of a lot. There's just a lot of moving parts, and so I'm not sure always the best way to kind of walk through all the moving parts. But yeah, so on the manufacturing side, so the chip designers pay TSMC and to a lesser extent Samsung to actually build the factories and fab the chips, right? And so TSMC is like the manufacturing partner for every company, on that list, the NVIDIA's, Qualcomm's, AMD's, down the list. And I mean, they've really gone from just being kind of a partner to really being an enabler, where now I would say, I mean, you read a lot of headlines about AMD going head to head with Intel for the first time really in 15 years, I would say, in terms of product competitiveness and being better positioned than Intel in many cases. And that's fundamentally enabled by TSMC. Like what's happened is that TSMC has passed Intel on manufacturing prowess. And so that has actually allowed AMD to compete head to head with kind of forever the 800-pound gorilla in the processor industry. And so that in itself, I think is just amazing. And so we can kind of talk about TSMC in more detail. But then the last kind of rung of this is the semi-equipment space. And so I put SPE and WFE because those are also, that's semi-production equipment and wafer fab equipment. Those are two different acronyms that get used with semiconductor equipment companies. And so the cool thing about semi-equipment is if you kind of go across this line is there are five kind of big companies that are making semi-equipment now. The industry is really consolidated. It actually probably will not consolidate anymore from here because the last few deals have been blocked by various regulatory bodies. But even though there are five of these companies making semi-equipment, they're all kind of in different niches of the actual fabrication process. And so like ASML has a monopoly in photolithography, which is kind of their core market. Lam Research as the second one competes with one or two companies in each kind of part of the market they play in. And then KLA, Tencor, the second from the right, has like in where they, in the markets where they play, they're 4 times bigger than the next biggest competitor. They have like 80% market share. And so it's another example of, even though there are 5 companies making semi equipment, actually each company within kind of the equipment value chain has incredible economics, because they're doing something that only either no company in the world can do, or only maybe 1 or 2 other companies in the world can do. So just to contrast this with Intel really quickly, because I think or with the IDM model. So IDM is integrated device manufacturer. This is just the chart on the right here. And that basically, at least in terms of leading edge chips, like in the like digital processing space, Intel is the only company left that's in the IDM space. And so for a long time, companies own their own factories, and everyone basically except for Intel has gone to this foundry model where they rely on TSMC, just because of the capital intensity and just the R&D burden of also keeping up with of Moore's law is also non-insignificant. And so IDM is different. It's you still rely on Cadence and Synopsys. Intel still has some of their own internal kind of design software tools, but they don't use them as much as they used to. And then they do their own chip design, and that's kind of married with their own manufacturing. And so that's why they call it integrated device manufacturer, is the design and manufacturing are done at the same company. And so their core architecture that I mentioned is x86. They do have other architectures, but this is really their kind of their workhorse. And then they rely on the equipment companies also. But I think just if you kind of like contrast the 2 slides, it's like you can really see, or two halves of the slide. The left side, there's kind of just like the spirit of openness, and there's more ecosystems, there's more variety. It just like creates so much room for innovation. And Intel has just been kind of like doing the same thing for a long time, and it honestly worked for them for a really long time, which is probably why they have this mindset. But you can kind of understand why the company has maybe lost their way a little bit, and then they even, I think, would acknowledge this, is they need to be a little more open and be a little more collaborative with the broader ecosystem, because you can't just it's a $500 billion industry. Intel has 75 billion of that, but there's a lot of other revenue and R&D and kind of white space out there that Intel has not really had access to. I think by choice. And so and then the other issue for Intel is they do have to fight kind of battles on 2 different fronts. Like on the design side, they have to compete with AMD, they have to compete with NVIDIA, who are phenomenally dynamic companies that are innovating extremely quickly and trying to attack Intel right in their core. And then they also have to compete with TSMC, who is on the manufacturing side, who is marching down Moore's law and has actually really taken the baton from Intel after Intel was the kind of the leader of Moore's law for 40 years. Now it's kind of fallen into TSMC's hands because Intel has stumbled. And so I think it's just become obvious if you see the value creation from the foundry model relative to the IDM model, kind of which model has worked. And honestly, I mean, on the left side of the chart, like TSMC is a $550 billion market cap, and NVIDIA itself is almost $500 billion now. And so, I mean, that's $1 trillion in market cap just from one sliver of the foundry model kind of ecosystem relative to Intel, which is probably I don't know where it is right now, 250 billion or something market cap, which is still amazing, but you can see where the value has accrued, especially over the last 18 months. I would say it's really even accelerated. So
and Jon, just to go into one of these verticals a little bit and not to rehash the conversation you had with Shane, but I just thought it was so funny. Brenton was talking about how some of these things are so complex that if you don't really know what you're doing, you get 1 + 1 = blue. And I thought that was hilarious. And then you went into ASML and EUV specifically. And I think just to like set the context for people here, like maybe just describe, when you say this is really difficult and there's only 1 or 2 players in the world that can do this, describe the CapEx and the R&D and just the technical expertise needed to do something like an ASML does.
Yeah, it's actually a really cool story. There's like a little bit of history behind it. So ASML emerged as this natural monopoly in semiconductors, or in lithography, early last decade, in part because they had 1 competitor, which is Nikon out of Japan, and they literally just kind of saw the R&D burden coming with kind of the complexity of what keeping up with Moore's law would entail, and they just didn't have the budget to do it, basically. And so interestingly, I think TSMC and Samsung and Intel were actually concerned about the future of Moore's law, because lithography is kind of the key enabling tool of building the feature size on the chip. When you hear about like 5 nanometers, that is printed by an ASML machine, and I can talk about kind of what that means and how hard that is. But so they actually got together, TSMC, Samsung, and Intel, and actually bought 25% of ASML in 2012 or 2013 or so, and injected capital into ASML to basically allow them to invest in the roadmap to come up with these extreme ultraviolet lithography systems. That's what EUV stands for. And so what they do is, so just the process of building a chip overall is when you want to print the feature size, which again, what I mentioned is kind of these are what you talk about 5 nanometer or 3 nanometer, is you actually shine light through a photomask, which is kind of like this stencil that the chip is built on or built into, and then it projects that design onto the wafer, and then you can actually etch that away. And so what's amazingly difficult about what ASML does, I mean, it's been difficult for a long time, but why EUV systems are so unique is just like the wavelength of light does not fit with etching or with printing these features that are only dozens of atoms wide, basically. And so what they basically have had to do is kind of bend or I would say brush up against the laws of of physics and material science and optics. And so what they do is so the wavelength of UV light is I think it's 13.5 nanometers, and you're even so with that you're trying to print something smaller than the wavelength of UV light that you're on the wafer. So what they do is this took them 10 years and or actually more than 10 years, 15 or 20 years, and billions of dollars worth of R&D to come up with this process. But they figured out that if you can take a vacuum and then drop tiny like microscopic droplets of molten tin into the vacuum and then hit it in midair with a laser, and then laser is pulsing 50,000 times a second. And that actually, so when the laser hits the tin, it creates a plasma, which actually radiates UV light. And then the UV light has to bounce off of a series of mirrors. And even the mirrors themselves that ASML works with are literally the most uniform mirrors on the planet, because normal mirrors would actually absorb the light because it's the wavelength is so fine. And so then that UV light will bounce off of these incredibly uniform mirrors through the chamber and then down onto the wafer and create that feature size. And so the precision, I mean, this is a term that ASML has used, is they compare it to shooting an arrow from the Earth and hitting an apple on the moon. Like it literally, I just think it's one of the coolest things that people like humankind have ever engineered, because it's just such a feat of science and of physics especially. And so their systems cost about $200 million per system right now, and that actually will go to about $300 million per system over the next 4 or 5 years or so. But I think that's just a great example. It's a good question, Bloss, and just how hard this stuff is and why. I mean, TSMC has kind of partnered with ASML to get EUV into the fab, and they actually own more EUV systems than any other company in the world. But they also have to figure out how to get these things working and get the throughput up so you can actually churn out enough wafers to make the economics work. Because even if you can kind of pull off the feats of science and have them working, if the economics don't make sense and you're all of a sudden chip prices are going up because you can't get enough wafers out, then you're actually not really solving any problems. And so I just think it's one of these amazing stories of also of the ecosystem coming together, which I think is just so cool that TSMC and Samsung and Intel all kind of came together with ASML to solve the problem. And there really were concerns about kind of the next leg of Moore's law without EUV systems, even 5 years ago. And now we've kind of solved them. And ASML has actually sold out of EUV systems now because everyone needs chips all of a sudden, in part because of COVID and work from home and more demand for PCs and data centers and things like that than we would have expected.
Amazing. Really helpful context, and just like what an incredible example of these things coming to life. So with that, should we dig into TSMC specifically, John? Is this a good time to do
sure.
that?
Yeah, let me
Cool.
stop sharing my screen here. So I mean, the founding story of TSMC is definitely worth understanding just for the context on the company. So TSMC was founded by Morris Chang, who is he's kind of like the grandfather of the modern semiconductor industry. Like I would say he's the most respected executive in semis in the last 20 years. So Morris was born in China and actually lived in China until he was 18, and then he came to the US to go to Harvard and then actually transfer to MIT. And then he had a really successful career at TI. And so he started at TI basically almost fresh out of college. I think he had one job for a few years before TI, but he rose through the ranks quickly there and actually ended up running the semiconductor business at TI, which was kind of the lifeblood. But at that point, this was in the I guess it was in the 70s and early 80s. TI was in other businesses. They were in consumer parts and calculators and other things. But he was the obvious kind of CEO candidate at TI after 30 years there, and he got passed over for the CEO role. And they told him that, point blank. And so he actually moved on. So at this point, he was in his mid 50s, and he was kind of recruited by some people in Taiwan to come back to Taiwan and try to help them incubate their own domestic semiconductor industry. And so just the fact that I think he was 55 when he founded TSMC is just like an amazing second act in terms of his career, right? And so
just really quick, like why Taiwan? Did he have any connections there, or like being born in China? Is there anything beyond that, or how did that come about?
Yeah, I think there actually were a lot of Chinese nationals who had come to the U.S. With especially to get kind of engineering backgrounds. They went to Taiwan during that time. And I think it was part of it. There was an organization called ITRI, ITRI, that was kind of a Taiwan state-sponsored organization that was trying to. I think just like I was kind of saying this earlier, a lot of nations really want to invest in semiconductors too, but just because they viewed it as a strategic industry. And so that was kind of the push to bring Morris back. And to be honest, he was running one of the biggest chip businesses in the world. And so he was kind of like a global leader on the global stage, which kind of helped, I think, also.
Thank you.
And so part of the dynamic when he got back to Taiwan is, Taiwan didn't really have any IP in semiconductors, and so he honestly didn't really know, I think, where to start. And so I think rather than kind of doing something really innovative in terms of like coming up with new intellectual property, he had this idea of inventing a novel business model, which was the idea of the foundry model. Because at the time, every company owned their own factories, and so if you wanted to start a chip company, you had to raise a ton of capital just to build a factory, and then kind of the actual designing the chip part, which is really where a lot of the special sauce lives, that was almost like an afterthought because you just had to find the capital to get a factory. And so Morris had talked to a lot of people over the years that they were design teams and they wanted to start their own business, but they couldn't get the capital, right? And so that was kind of his key insight, is that if there was a pure play, and at the time you could, if you wanted to design a chip and have Texas Instruments or Intel or someone kind of fab it for you, you could do that, but you had to compete with like Intel's internal volume, and if all of a sudden the fabs were full, then you wouldn't get any wafers, right? And so that was Morris's kind of key insight, is to build the world's first pure play leading edge foundry where they would not compete with their customers. They wouldn't design any chips. All they would do was manufacture chips. And I mean, the way he's described it in a few interviews is honestly was kind of a solution looking for a problem at the time. What they would really mostly do was kind of get like when times were tight and their big customers, who at the time were companies like Motorola or Philips, they would kind of, when their fabs were full, they would kind of give TSMC some kind of like excess business, and they would kind of they would use TSMC as like a buffer manufacturing base, basically. So which is not a great business, because then the demand goes away and you're kind of stuck with factories that aren't full, right? But having this idea of like a trusted partner, I think one of the things that if you like see any interview with Morris or hear any executive talk about Morris and kind of the TSMC mindset, it's a little bit cliche, but like they really did build their business on trust and integrity. And like if you are a fabless company and you're designing a chip, you're really betting your company on TSMC's ability to fab it, which is really unique and honestly I think really special. And so the way the history of the company evolved, so that Morris kind of had this idea, and then they started building factories, and they licensed process technology from RCA in Japan, and they really just kind of chugged along for I would say like 20 years up until kind of I would say right around the financial crisis, to be honest. And that's when, coming out of the GFC, that's when you really saw the mobile revolution and kind of the rise of the smartphone. And honestly, at the same time, Intel was stumbling. And so like the history of TSMC goes hand in hand with the history of Intel. But with Intel missing the mobile market, all of a sudden, a lot of TSMC's fabless customers, got bigger and more successful really quickly. So like Qualcomm is probably the prime example of they really ran the table on the smartphone market. And then in 2013, Apple also brought their business to TSMC. Apple actually originally was at Samsung. And so if you like look back on how TSMC got so successful, kind of, or at least kind of hit this first inflection, the first point was just kind of you had the rise of the mobile ecosystem, which was ARM, which, I mean, ARM had gone from like it was like a $1 or $2 billion market cap company into, you know, the tens of billions relatively quickly because they had so much success in mobile. And so ARM and then TSMC and all of their partners, you know, really won the mobile market, and that really kicked off the flywheel where all of a sudden TSMC went through this really heavy investment period in 2012 through 2014 or so. They spent 50% of sales on CapEx for 3 years, and at the time people thought they were crazy. But then it's like the mobile market just took off, and they had the courage to actually have the capacity there to work with all their customers. And then they had, from having all the capacity, they had, you know, more revenue than all their potential competitors. And then they could invest more heavily both in R&D and in CapEx. And so all of a sudden, it's like they kind of got the flywheel going. And so that was kind of their first big inflection. And then the next one was another kind of Intel miss and TSMC beneficiary is kind of in the back half of last decade. Intel really started to slip on there were two things that happened. The first is Intel slipped on their manufacturing cadence. Where, you know, for forever, following Moore's law, they're moving down each process technology node every 2 years. But their 10 nanometer node, it took them 5 years. And so like for forever, TSMC was was kind of, you know, 1 or 2 process technology nodes behind Intel, and they were actually able to catch them, which, you know, put all of TSMC's customers on par with Intel. And now actually they're a little bit ahead of Intel, which is really important to kind of back to my point on, if you think about, you know, AMD competing head to head with Intel, they actually have superior, you know, technology now than Intel does, but that's provided by TSMC. And then the other thing that Intel missed, it's another. Oh, go ahead.
I might just say, John, like I was reading an article the other day, which was phenomenal. It really amazed me. Not just that, but you were outlining the ARM architecture there, right, and how it really took off with the mobiles. But if you look at the new Apple M1 chip, this is what they're putting into laptops. It's based on what they developed for the iPhone, and it can emulate the 86 architecture faster than Intel's fastest chip now. Like, it's just, they've also lost that, right? They can't even win in their own segment anymore. So it's
that's right. I'm working on my M1 Mac right now, which is funny. That's funny, kind of thinking about it, but it's amazing. I mean, I used AMD as an example of you know, being able to leverage TSMC's technology to take on Intel head to head, but the great examples, the other two, are Apple, where your point is spot on that you know, for forever, you know, a smartphone chip from Apple was like almost as good as what you could get into a PC, but with, I think, Apple's strength in engineering and the size of their, honestly, the size of their organization is incredible. But also the fact that, you know, an Apple M1 chip is actually built on technology manufacturing that's a generation ahead of what Intel is bringing. And so it's just with the benefits of Moore's law, it's faster, it consumes more power, and it's also a lot cheaper. And so, and to your point, Chris, you can emulate, like, there's kind of an abstraction layer where you can actually run, at least for now, if you need to, if there are programs that, you know, aren't compatible with the Apple M1 ecosystem yet, then, you know, then you can kind of run them and simulate them on your M1 powered PC, which is amazing. And then the other one, actually, the other example I was going to use is Amazon, where Amazon is designing their own server chips now using the ARM architecture, and they're in a lot of benchmarks and a lot of the data that they've put out, those for certain applications, that those chips are actually a lot more efficient and provide better performance than Intel chips do. So it's amazing to me the way that the TSMC you know, has gone from really being a partner to being like a true enabler, where they're enabling their customers to either move into new markets or to take on you know, kind of the big players in the industry head to head. So and I guess that actually feeds exactly into what I was about to say, is the two things that Intel missed in the back half of last decade that really benefited TSMC. One was their manufacturing fell off, which we have kind of talked about, and that's opened the door for companies to take on Intel head to head. And again, it's kind of like this flywheel effect that every time, you know, Apple is moving all of that revenue from Intel to TSMC when they're buying, I think more than half of the Macs being sold now are on M1 silicon. And so that's not insignificant, both for TSMC, you know, and for Intel. And so that kind of helps them keep the the flywheel going. And then the other thing that Intel really missed is just this idea of heterogeneous computing that for forever, if you went into a data center, and then the data center just become such an important market in semiconductors over the last 5 years. But if you go back into it and looked into a data center in 2015, like 99.5% of the chips in a data center were Intel Xeons, like they just own the market. But with the rise of artificial intelligence and GPUs, and honestly just a slowdown in x86 performance from Intel, you're seeing just kind of a slew of new architectures move into the data center. So GPUs are moving in. You're seeing ARM-based servers from companies like Amazon move in. You're seeing custom chips from the big cloud players, like Google has what they call the TPU, which is basically their internal version that's kind of similar to a GPU, but built especially for the data center. And so now, if 6 or 7 years later, you go into a data center, and certainly the percentage of workloads that are being run on x86 are going down, and you're just seeing kind of this renaissance in innovation in the data center, and everything that's being built on these new architectures is all being built on TSMC. And so again, it's just like this example of, you can see the share shifting away from Intel into TSMC, and then TSMC. I think honestly, one of the things we worried about as investors like 6 or 7 years ago is what's ever going to use this capacity for? Like, what's next after the smartphone? I don't know why we're going to need 2 nanometer chips and 1.5 nanometer chips. And the answer really, in addition to smartphones, which is still a really important market, is the cloud and artificial intelligence and what you call high performance computing, or HPC, which is a big segment that TSMC actually reports now. And that's the idea of like running really heavy simulations, like honestly, gene sequencing and genomics and sequencing the COVID strain. It is a great example of that. Or like, doing like seismic modeling and weather modeling, and just some of the heaviest computing tasks that researchers do now. A lot of that is being shifted away from Intel onto TSMC's customers, onto GPUs and onto specialized chips. And once again, that just kind of keeps the flywheel for TSMC going.
Yep.
So,
sorry, John, can I ask a question just related to that?
Yes.
So, like the margins here for a really capital intensive business are like insane. Like, I've never seen such a capital intensive business with such high margins over a long period of time. And that's even with equipment that depreciates pretty rapidly. And clearly they've earned that with the trust, the ecosystem investing ahead of demand. I mean, to what extent do you think there's a risk? They've committed 100 billion over the next few years, really capital intensive. Like, how sustainable is that? How far into the future, if you put your investor hat on, because the market has woken up a little bit to the NZS thesis on this ecosystem. And I mean, I've never seen those kinds of margins in that degree of capital intensity. And then when you layer on top of that, this equipment, is going out of business pretty quickly as well, and it's expensive. You've got to run the equipment, the yield management on the equipment, you've got to get pretty high utilization on that. To justify those investments. Just curious as to like how you think about that risk. And
I think it's a good question. I think I think TSMC actually has more pricing power than they exert right now, to be honest. I think if they went to all of their customers and said, we're raising prices by an additional 10 or 15%, there's really nothing that they could do. I think TSMC is such an amazing partner and thinks so long term that that they would never do that. And I think that's why it's such kind of a high, as we would call it, a high NZS company, because they really are all about ecosystem and planning for the next kind of 10 or 20 years versus trying to extract more value near term to make numbers for the year or something like that. And then longer term, I mean, I think as long as the economics kind of work for the whole industry, because you really have to think about, it's like TSMC has to fab the chip and make the economics work for Apple, which Apple has to make, then Apple has to get that chip into a phone and make the economics work for the end customer, right? So there's always kind of this value chain idea. But as long as kind of we're on the trajectory of Moore's law and we're getting the the benefits that their customers expect, and I think TSMC's margins are relatively safe from like a long-term perspective. And then the two things I would add to that. One of them is if you look at TSMC's like quarterly slide decks, about half their revenue is kind of like true like leading edge, like what right now it would be 5 nanometer or 7 nanometer. That's technology that's been rolled out within the last few years. But actually about half the business is nodes that are older. It's older manufacturing technology, and that's something that TSMC does differently is they'll build the capacity and then they'll run it there as long as their customers need it, which in some cases is 20 years. And so running that trailing edge capacity is amazingly profitable because, to your point, the equipment depreciates over 5 years. And so then you have, fully depreciated equipment, and the ASPs of the chips aren't quite as high, so maybe the revenue isn't quite as high, but that's kind of a nice margin buffer. And so I think that is one thing that can help TSMC on the margin front. And then the other thing, I think one more near-term concern that I think is totally legitimate is, they're spending 30-ish billion a year for the next 3 years, give or take, on CapEx. We're coming out of this really kind of funky cycle of, COVID and work from home, and, the PC market and the smartphone market and the tablet market. These are all like pretty mature markets that have been growing like extremely quickly over the last, 18 months, just because of COVID, or because of work from home, and honestly because consumer balance sheets are pretty healthy also, I think. And so I think there's other kind of cyclical concerns, like the crypto craze is another thing where, TSMC probably has 5 or 6% of their sales at least they're going into crypto mining right now. And so there's a little bit of a concern of, could you have more of a near-term dislocation? I think that's totally possible, right? That if crypto demand implodes, or it turns out that, notebooks and PCs and tablets go back to more like the 2016 to 2018 run rates for demand, then I think that will be a little bit painful for the whole industry, but TSMC would get caught up in that. And so I think that would be more of a near-term problem. And I think they can kind of flex their CapEx, but it's kind of classic TSMC to think long-term. And I think one of the things they have shown over the years is they just have so much faith in the semiconductor industry to innovate and like bring, invent something that consumers and their customers are going to want. And so they would rather kind of like build the capacity. It's kind of a build it and they will come idea, right? And so they'd rather build the capacity and have it than, and honestly keep the flywheel going, versus not have the capacity and all of a sudden, if demand is still as strong as it is right now in 3 years, then their customers are looking over at Samsung or trying to figure out, trying to find another partner. So it is a balance, but I think that, and to your point, a lot of people think about TSMC as kind of like a contract manufacturer, and a lot of those companies in the tech ecosystem have like 8% gross margins, and TSMC is 50% gross margins. It's just incredible. I think it shows the value add. They're not just like a contract manufacturer or an assembler, like they're a true partner that really, is an enabler. And also the fact that they have this business model uniqueness, that they're the only company that can do really like truly leading edge, and be a foundry partner, and not have any sort of competition. Like you can work with Samsung, but again, if Samsung's smartphone sales are really, really strong all of a sudden, then you have to worry about, do I get that capacity if Samsung needs it, kind of thing, and so the purity of the business model, I think, always is part of the conversation around their margin structure.
How does TSMC price? How do they charge? Is everything contractual? Is it by volume, or how do they think about that?
Well, I just dumped my water all over my desk. So they charge by the wafer, actually, and so there are thousands and thousands of chips on a wafer, and so that's just how they price. And so they do they have like rolling pricing, especially with big customers. And if you really like follow the kind of like the tech press in Asia, especially, they'll say like TSMC is raising prices, for Q3 wafers by 5% or whatever it is. And so that's and then obviously there is a lot of customer concentration in their business. Like Apple is a 25% customer. They probably have a handful of 10%-ish customers if you look at like the NVIDIAs and AMDs that run a lot of volume. And so that is part of it. Also, is obviously the big customers get preferential pricing generally. But not too much, because otherwise their margins would be lower. It's kind of amazing. If Apple's most companies that have Apple's a 25% customer don't put up those kind of margins.
Yeah, totally. And do they hold any inventory, John, or is it kind of like on demand? They'll produce it and ship it right away.
That's a good question. And I think pretty much all their customers would hold the inventory on their own balance sheets. So the inventory risk for TSMC, honestly, it's more downstream, either that their customers have too much inventory, or like their customers are in the semi supply chain. There are like 6 layers of inventory, and so the concern would be even if there are too many cars on the lot at car dealerships. Eventually that like works back to, you know, the automotive tier ones and tier twos, and then back to the chip guys eventually. And so that's kind of the main concern on inventory is just honestly the bullwhip effect and the way the industry has been structured forever.
Yeah. And they, you know, they're so dominant, John, and they play such an important role in the world. What could go wrong? And if things keep going like this, is there any chance they are thought of as a utility where, you know, it's a global utility and TSMC just like helps the world grow? Or I don't know, how do you think about TSMC in that world?
Yeah, I mean, I think what could go wrong, one is like if we just run out of a reason to build, you know, really leading edge chips. Like I think there is a little bit of an open question. I think at some point, like, are our smartphones fast enough? If we get to a point where we have 10-day battery life or something, and we've maybe, you know, cured cancer using high performance computing and that kind of thing, maybe at some point we don't need, you know, really leading edge chips anymore, or just the economics become prohibitive. Like I did mention that, you know, designing some of these chips costs $500 million, and that probably, you know, will move towards, it'll probably cost $1 billion to design a chip in 5 years. And so I think the economic model of the industry is probably one big risk. So that's the biggest one for me. I mean, honestly, I feel like as long as TSMC management has kind of this like ecosystem centric idea of the way they want to run the company, and by not extracting too much value in the near term, like enabling their customers. I mean, a lot of their customers actually have higher margins than TSMC does, you know, which is kind of funny for a platform of this scale that they would kind of allow that. But I think as long as they have that mindset, then I think that they'll be fine. And then the other question is just kind of like the future of Moore's law, right? Like we do have, I think, 10 years of visibility into scaling down kind of like the process technology nodes, even if it isn't like a pure Moore's law. Like in TSMC actually has this concept of more than more, which is kind of like all these things they're doing around the edges to help you know, their customers keep improving performance, even if it's not like pure Moore's law, which is like the idea of planar scaling, like just making a house with smaller rooms over time kind of thing. They're helping customers build like 3-dimensional chips. And that actually is a really sticky relationship with their customers. But if we can't, if we hit the wall on Moore's law, or if there's, you know, the next wave of semiconductors becomes, or of computing comes from like quantum or from some other substrate where TSMC has no expertise, then I guess they would be vulnerable kind of like in the mid 2030s. I mean, I think that they'll just be on the forefront because they have the scale and the partnership in the ecosystem, or the partnerships in the ecosystem to, you know, to stay on the very bleeding edge. But that would say that's another risk. And then, I mean, I think they are kind of a utility in a weird way. They're just like the facilitator of, if you think economic growth is going to be tied to technology, and you know, semiconductors really are like the supporting layer of technology growth, then in kind of a weird way, they're honestly like too big to fail now, right? That's part of the reason that the US is trying to get TSMC to build factories on US soil, is because they're too close to China, and you know, the world kind of can't exist without TSMC anymore. And so that's you know, that's another dynamic that I don't know how that could play out at some point, if they would end up being regulated or something, just because it's honestly, and in terms of the tech ecosystem, I would say it's one of the top 5 most strategic companies in the world, which is kind of amazing.
For sure. Is there anything besides what's kind of been discussed around Taiwan, China that's worth digging into? You know, there's geopolitical risk, but anything worthwhile there?
So we talked about it a lot in this Knowledge Project podcast that I think you sent around. So there's not a whole lot incremental. I mean, I guess one thing is just the, I think especially with the shortages, for whatever reason, that has really brought the importance of semis into kind of like the national focus. And so I think even though bringing chip manufacturing onshore will not like solve for shortages, I think shortages will just happen because the industry has some cyclicality, and you'll always have recessions like we went through with COVID, and then demand will always come back probably faster than people think. And that's just how you get shortages, especially because it takes 4 months to build a chip. So like having a long lead time product kind of tends to lead to shortages. But I think just the way that we've kind of moved the ball in terms of bringing manufacturing to the US is noteworthy over the last 6 months, because I mean, it really was like an open question if we were going to, you know, get TSMC to start building stuff here. You know, besides this like small Arizona fab that they'd announced about a year ago, and now their fabs in Arizona have really started to kind of like multiply. Like I think it probably will be 6 sites now. You know, Samsung is going to invest more heavily, I think, in Austin, where they already have capacity. And then part of the reason that matters is, first of all, it's just really good for the equipment companies, like for the you know 5 companies I laid out in the whiteboarding exercise because the industry is just like incredibly efficient right now, and that's like just been the product of globalization that everyone is so profitable because I think we kind of like hit peak efficiency in terms of semiconductor manufacturing, and now we're going to kind of walk that back a little bit, I think, and focus more on resilience than on efficiency. And so I think, and governments honestly will probably pay for a lot of that, and so I think that's going to benefit the whole ecosystem just because it'll be more robust, and it's certainly, you can like look at the capital intensity of the industry over time, and it's been like in a pretty narrow band, especially over the last decade, and now that's going to, I think, tick back up just because you're kind of building like redundant manufacturing capacity basically if we're going to have fabs in in the US that will be kind of like buffer capacity or kind of there for strategic reasons rather than just to meet demand kind of thing.
Totally. Jon, is there anything else on TSMC you want to cover? Should we open it up to the floor, or what do you think?
No, I guess a few things that I had that I think are noteworthy is just I think this transition from kind of like TSMC has really been a smartphone powered company for a long time. I mean, smartphones are still like roughly half their revenue, but this handoff from smartphones to like the next generation of revenue growth for them, which will come from high performance computing and from AI and the data center. And I think that is noteworthy because that wasn't clear a few years ago, kind of how they were going to hand the baton to kind of like the next leg of growth. And especially after we kind of ramp 5G, like smartphones are a pretty mature category. And so TSMC honestly being reliant on smartphones was always a little bit of something that bothered me. And then I think it is interesting that they've kind of always talked about their revenue growth. They have always kind of said 5 to 10% revenue growth is kind of their target, like 5-year CAGR, and now they're talking about 10 to 15% growth and being at the high end of that for a few years. And so kind of talking about how they went through this investment cycle 10 years ago to get ready for the smartphone. They're doing the same thing to get ready for this kind of like data center and high performance computing demand that's coming, which is amazing. And so it's just kind of fun for me to watch them kind of get ready for the next leg of growth, and hopefully it's not like a huge phase of overinvestment, right? But I think that's pretty noteworthy.
For sure. Rishi, I know you might have had a question. Is that right?
Oh, no, I just wanted to maybe make a comment. Jon and I have spoken about some of these questions, and I didn't know if it was appropriate to jump in at this point.
Go for it.
I think one question, Jon, you and I discussed is about geopolitical risk. And I think one of the questions that is very commonly asked is about TSMC and geo risk with China. And the non-zero sum way of thinking about this, at least Jon and I have talked about, is the very fact that the whole world depends on TSMC and hence has the non-zero sum, makes it even more likely that the risk is far less than people think about. Because, I mean, this is almost to the point where it's so critical that countries would go to war on this particular issue. I mean, we already know on just one shortage, the auto chips, how critical of an issue it has become. If you literally had TSMC not operating, industries would come to a halt and countries would go to war. And so that puts in the non-zero sum that because so many countries and economies and industries are dependent on it, it would almost be their last resort. At that point, does it even really matter, if TSMC is operating or not operating? We may have like far bigger problems at that point. And so this is one of the tail risks that's possible, not with just TSMC, but with anything, right? Like if you had countries going on war, potentially a World War III type of a situation, what does it matter? What happens with TSMC at that point? And so, in a way, one way to think about strength of a company is to think about like 7 powers and its moat. But the other way to think about it is like the positive sum that you've added to the world, and the world will then kind of support you because they want you to coexist and survive and thrive, right? And so this is kind of that situation where nobody really wants TSMC to stop operating. So that's my view. It could be naive. I don't know if Jon, you agree. At least you sounded like you agreed with me last time when we spoke.
Good to see you, Rishi. Yeah, I tend to agree. It's kind of funny. I mean, people do ask us because TSMC is a big position in our portfolio, and we do talk a lot about this tail risk of geopolitical conflict. And honestly, obviously, the relationship between Taiwan and China is kind of like tenuous at best. And my kind of like cheeky response is always, it just if like China moves to seize Taiwan in part to take over TSMC, then like the performance of our portfolio is not going to be top of mind for me, because we'll be kind of moving into World War III, and it's just going to be a really scary time for the world. But I think that TSMC's significance to the world really, hopefully, kind of protects them, right? That I do think the U.S. would go to war. And I actually think the Trump administration really understood this, and I think the Biden administration also really understands just kind of like the criticality of semiconductors, and especially of TSMC, and the fact that like the chips that go into our like F-35 strike fighters and like drones and everything we would use in some sort of a military effort are also all built at TSMC. And so I think if things really got ugly, I think we'll do anything we can to protect them, right? So I think that's a really good point.
Outside of TSMC, John, what other companies would you dig into? Anything else that's particularly interesting, business model wise or tech wise or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think NVIDIA is just an amazing case study, just from being an important but relatively niche company in gaming to really catching this inflection in artificial intelligence, and kind of being ready for that to take over the market, and taking GPUs from being like a niche processor for gaming to really general purpose computing, and facilitating this like whole wave we've had in AI. I think is just like incredible. And their data center business has gone from before like AI really took hold in 2014 or so, it was like $100 million a quarter, and now it's $2 billion a quarter. And they are like really becoming the thought leader on the data center. I would say even more so than Intel, when that's always been kind of their backyard. And so I think that's a really good one. And then my kind of like geeky approach is I love the equipment companies, just because it's an amazing case study in just like a boom bust cycle of like painful companies to invest in, where they used to grow for 2 years and get cut in half, and then grow for 2 years and get cut in half, and lose money at the trough of the cycle. And now the market's consolidated, their customers are consolidated. They all kind of do something that's really amazing and unique, that really facilitates something that the world really needs now. And so I think all the equipment companies are fascinating, actually. And so those are the two, probably the two parts of the value chain that I think are most topical, just because it's like this amazing change we've seen over the last 7 years. And honestly, the stocks have all done extremely well too, obviously.
Yeah, I interrupted someone before.
Sorry, Blas, no problem at all. You actually asked the question I was going to ask, but maybe to relate it to that, on NVIDIA, should they be allowed by ARM? Would you allow that acquisition?
I would not, if it were up to me. Yeah. Like, I just think, I mean, I actually think Jensen will do amazing things with it. I mean, he is a visionary, and I think we've been watching the ARM ecosystem try to develop, especially in the server market, for 13 years, for my whole career, basically. And I mean, ARM has like this amazing reach as just with the size of the ecosystem, but they don't have a lot of R&D dollars, because the licensing model, it's super high margin, but I mean, they don't have billions of dollars to put into the data center. And I think if NVIDIA had their hands on it, they would do that, and it would really accelerate, kind of this idea of heterogeneous computing and just having more diversity in the data center. And honestly, it's a good outcome for customers, because they can do a lot of computing problems, more or less expensively than you would do it on an Intel processor. But I think just the fact that, similar to TSMC, ARM's business model is based on being Switzerland and being kind of the neutral party that is a trusted partner for all their customers. And NVIDIA competes head to head with some of ARM's biggest licensees, like Qualcomm. NVIDIA and Qualcomm are competing head to head for kind of like the future processing that's going to happen in the car. Is probably one good example. And Qualcomm has ambitions in the data center also. And so I just think from a integrity of ARM's business model perspective, it probably should not be allowed to go through. But who knows? It's actually getting, I would say, more momentum as weeks go on, and some of the big licensees are coming out in support of the deal. So if Jensen pulls it off, it'll just be fun to watch as an observer, because I think he'll do. ARM has obviously built an amazing platform already with relatively few resources, and so if they kind of get this injection and kind of get to participate in NVIDIA's roadmap, it could really be a game changer, actually.
Okay, thank you. And Blas, if it's okay, can I ask just one last question, if it's okay? Yeah, thank you. Sorry, John. It's just a kind of more of an industry structure one, because I mean, this is really fascinating in that something happened along the way that took Intel off its perch. It didn't happen sort of immediately, but ARM came along, the foundry business model came along, and somebody who looked like an unassailable leader, slowly lost it. An awful lot of people didn't see that happening. I'm just wondering, are there any analogs in other industries at the moment where there's something that you've come across, that there's something happening in the industry structure right now, or even things that you could look out for in the industry structure that would have you thinking, hang on a sec, the industry, the nature, the game has changed here, and we need to be thinking about the leaders in a different way and the emerging leaders in a different way. I'm just wondering maybe if you've got anything to say on that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, there aren't any really obvious analogies I can think of, and I think it is, I kind of mentioned this, but it's just kind of a classic innovator's dilemma problem, and maybe honestly a little bit of like a non-zero sumness problem that Intel, I think, was probably taking too much for themselves and not sharing enough with the industry. And so maybe one analogy I would draw is honestly to the big tech platforms that I think, maybe Apple specifically, because they're in the news the most right now, that kind of this like customer outcry and getting taken to task in the EU by Spotify and by the big developers here in the US, by Epic and folks like that. I just think that is a sign that they're probably maybe have overshot a little bit on the amount of economics they're willing to take for themselves. And I do think that maybe not on a 2-year horizon, but on a 10-year horizon, I think you want to be on the side of all of your developers and your partners, and not kind of like butting heads with them. And so maybe that's one example that I think we at least have our kind of antennas up to listen to, despite the the fundamentals obviously being pretty solid the next few years.
When you were mentioning that, John, and showing the picture and showing the openness, the number of players in the ecosystem, the immediate thing that came to my mind was like Linux in the open source model versus Windows, which is obviously a pretty close space, but it was a similar thing where like Microsoft had complete dominance of the server market and then completely lost it because of similar reasons, I think, like looking back. Not something you can invest behind, Laura, I'm afraid, anymore, but certainly a pattern, I think.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And actually there's a little bit of parallel to that in chips now, because there is an open source architecture called RISC-V. That's RISC, and then it's a V for the 5. And that is kind of the same or a similar idea, that they want to take an open source core, and then there are companies that kind of want to be like the Red Hats of RISC-V, right, and kind of take the open source cores and license the core and develop their own ecosystems and semiconductors on top of that. And so there's actually a report like 2 weeks ago that one of the more prominent kind of like Red Hat parallels is called Sci-Fi, and Intel is actually trying to buy them, which is interesting. It actually would show kind of some forward thinking, I think, on Intel's part to actually embrace disruption a little more and move to these maybe future architectures that aren't huge needle movers right now, but I think could be pretty prominent in the next 5 to 10 years.
Totally. John, so I feel like if TSMC was more of an American company, that Morris Chang would kind of be in the same level of some of these tech icons. You mentioned his ability to think holistically about the whole ecosystem and think out 10, 20 years. Any other lessons you've drawn from him as you've followed him and TSMC for 12, 13 years now?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I do think, it first of all just comes back to, it is kind of like cheesy to say it, but just like trust and integrity and also like customer centricity, I think are just incredible. Like there's this kind of this funny anecdote. I assume it's true that Morris he got remarried in, I think, early 2000s, and he was on his honeymoon, and he actually took a break from his honeymoon to go visit Jensen at NVIDIA and have a one-on-one meeting to like talk about his roadmap and the wafers they were going to need and things like that. And if you ever like see Jensen speak with Morris, I mean, it's like he like reveres him more so than you would revere like your like wise grandfather. It really is just like amazing, the interpersonal touch that he has had. And so I think that's probably a really good example. It's not just I'd say the other one is actually just like he really is courageous. Like the guts it took to really invest heavily in these like big investment cycles, and you're even kind of seeing it right now, that there are a lot of naysayers when you're kind of putting out this level of capital outlay, and it can go really poorly, and you can crush your margins for 3 or 4 years. But the courage to do that and do it with long-term thinking in mind, and never taking too much value out of the ecosystem than you need to, I think are just like the classic ways to build a company that really, like we talk about
Does he still have controlling interest, or how much of the company does he own at this point?
He owns 0.5% of the company. So I think that's also a little bit of a difference between, I mean, part of it, I think, was just the time when TSMC was founded. Like, you didn't have, super voting rights, and, founders didn't have, he also had to raise a lot of capital, which was different than, starting like an internet company where you can, just have a huge stake in the company. But I totally agree. Like, I think if TSMC was more of a Western company, and honestly, maybe he was like a little bit younger, just because it's hard to be kind of an icon when you're, he's, I think, in his 90s now. He would be a household name the same way that, all the mega cap tech platform founders are, right?
And they've handled succession relatively well, I guess.
Yes, so far. So they actually had they kind of a hiccup where I think he moved into the chairman role in probably like late 2000s or early last decade, and the other management team kind of actually got distracted, and they moved into solar and LEDs and some of these kind of like adjacent semiconductor technologies that I think were kind of hot at that time. And I think people honestly didn't really see the future of semis quite that well back then. And so he actually kind of moved back into the CEO role and got the company on track. And so the second time around, Mark Liu, who's the CEO now, it's been seamless so far. They've executed it like phenomenally well. I mean, really, the execution the last 5 years, I'd argue, is the best it's ever been, just because they've really inflected in terms of growth and in terms of technology prowess that they've kind of overtaken Intel, right?
Jon, this has been awesome. Look, thank you so much for spending this much time with us, and just really appreciate your insights on this. Any final points or asks or anything like that you want to leave us with?
No, I'm happy to do it. Thanks for having me. It's fun. I love all the questions, and feel free to reach out to me or anyone else. We have a lot of stuff about semis on our website actually too. We've got our emails up there, so if you want to talk about semis or anything else, just drop us a line. So, and then Blas has our contact info also. So
yeah, Jon, thank you so much, man. This was an absolute blast. The mind map of the whole ecosystem will stay with me for a while. I really appreciate you doing that beforehand. It helped a lot.
Cool. Yeah, I'm glad it was helpful. I'm really happy to do it. So have a great day.
Cool. You too. Thanks, everyone. All right.
Bye, Ron.
Bye.